Sustainless is a very polarizing topic in the Honkai Star Rail community. I've actually wanted to make this video for a while to give my opinions on the topic. In the context of meta, Sustainless is technically always superior to sustained team comps, with the sole exception of Castorice. Yes, even My Day, Every Night, and Blade all prefer Sustainless, despite being HP scaling. I'll elaborate on that later in the video. For most players, Sustainless seems to feel like a taboo and an unreachable domain for some. However, I don't think this to be the case. Sustainless has many benefits beyond just trying to zero cycle, and can be a fun way to enjoy the game too. In this video, I want to talk about the benefits and drawbacks of Sustainless, and also how they are for actual characters in the game. I also want to give my opinions on this playstyle. I want to take a moment to say if you don't care about Sustainless, then this video probably isn't for you. The endgame is still perfectly capable of being cleared without having to go Sustainless. So now, let's discuss the benefits of Sustainless. The most obvious benefit is that you do much more damage. Any buffs offered by an additional buffer will always be much more superior to another sustain. All the sustains offer very little buffs, and even as powerful as Hyacinth is, she generally doesn't offer enough to override a sustainless buffer in terms of damage. Doing more damage means you will generally clear faster. Clearing faster doesn't always have to be zero cycle. There's still many reasons to go sustainless to clear faster. What do I mean by this? Let's say for example, my sustainless team can 1 cycle, but with this sustain I need 4 cycles. Let's just say my 2 other teams need 5 cycles to clear. I would use a total of 14 cycles in this case, but I need to clear the entire Memory of Chaos under 12 cycles to full clear. By going sustainless, I will bring it down to 11 cycles, allowing me to full clear. Clearing faster might also be a difference between getting full star or being able to zero cycle king or another boss. Of course, this is just an on-paper example. Sustainless can also make team building more flexible. You don't have to have all 3 teams go sustainless. You can have some teams go sustainless, and you may be able to free up your sustain for tougher fights. For example, if Pollux is in a rotation, you can go sustainless on one team, so you can afford to use Hyacinth or another healer against Pollux instead of distributing sustains and taking your score. Another not so logical benefit of Sustainless is that it's just fun. Personally, I like playing Sustainless sometimes because it allows me to do more damage, and at least for me, I like seeing big numbers. Clearing faster in general is also just more satisfying. Sustainless also means I'm probably using most of my characters, so it feels more rewarding than pushing the limits of my characters. However, there are drawbacks to Sustainless. The most obvious is that you might just die. If you die, you can't exactly clear the stage because your characters are, well, dead. Another is the investment required. Sustainless usually has a certain level of investment threshold you need to overcome, depending on your team comp, so you can reliably clear, or else it would be nearly impossible to do so. Another major drawback is that it requires some skill to pilot. Of course, it can vary depending on the team, but typically using a sustain makes it more comfortable and stress-free to pilot, while going sustainless means you actually need a decent amount of skill to properly play the team. Sustainless is still a semi-taboo topic in the Star Rail community, with some people shaming it as unrealistic. The most common critique I hear about is that it takes endless resetting. But if you have the means, it does not take endless resetting. Most of the time, you're only guaranteed to get hit a certain amount of time in Sustainless. If you get hit more than that, then usually your team was never strong enough anyways, and you might have to fix your build. The resetting usually comes from trying to zero cycle or hyper-optimizing rotation. The Sustainless rotation itself usually isn't that hard. For example, in the last Memory of Chaos against Darksam, Anaxa will always be able to sustainless against Darksam. He would just 1 cycle, but trying to do it in 0 cycle requires some luck and RNG. Anaxa's team would take a fixed amount of damage, and even with the worst RNG, the entire team will always live. The same is for my Herda runs in Pure Fiction. I never have to reset if I just want to clear it in 1 cycle. Many times when I try to 0 cycle or optimize my score in APOC, I could easily just clear it at 1 cycle, or have a lower score without any resetting. Another critique I hear a lot is the use of Ego in Vomvac set, which is true to a certain extent, but not necessarily. Most Ego set users would use Ego even if you're using them with a sustain, such as Cyrene, Sub-DPS, Anaxa, well, etc. The same can be applied for Vomvac, such as Robin, Rame, Mornaxblade, etc. You'll usually use them on these sets even with a sustain. Notable examples I can think of where you would change is probably Tribby, where you might build fast Tribby for sustainless, but you can also use Poet Tribby and achieve similar results. Wombat is mainly used for 0 cycle and AB cheating shenanigans. It isn't as important in sustainless as people think. Ego barely matters as well. I have never changed any of my characters' builds to Ego just because it's for sustainless. Except maybe Tribute, but I use Ego on her even as Sustain. Either way, they were already on Ego build or they weren't. Now I want to talk about Sustainless teams. Everyone already knows break teams and final teams are good at Sustainless. Break teams like Firefly can break bars and delay enemies to prevent taking damage. The gap between Sustainless break and using a sustain is also just much bigger than other teams. Lingsha and Gallagher simply do not offer enough. When Final enters his zone, the rest of the team cannot take any damage, and he can also heal back when he does damage. Tying back to my previous point on how even HP scalers will prefer Sustainless, I want to elaborate on this. My Day is ironically one of the best characters to go Sustainless. His Sustainless teams are all HP scalers, or can build fully defensive stats such as RMC, so they're already more likely to survive any damage. My Day can also taunt damage to prevent his teammates from taking damage, alongside his ability to revive 3 times without exiting his Vendetta state. Afterwards, he can still revive, so long as he is in a Vendetta state, except now he will just exit it when he's down. Evernight just does so much damage, and she's able to manipulate AV, especially with her broken E2, and with her spreads, if she has Siren on the team. Similar to My Day, her entire team are all HP scalers or can build fully defensive stats, like RMC. The benefit of running Sustainless on her simply outweighs any buffs that Hyacinth can provide, especially at E0. There's also Mordenax's Blade, though I do think his situation is a bit more precarious. For main DPS Mordenax's Blade, he simply does so much damage, he will almost never reach 1 HP, so he will never have a need for a sustain. However, he benefits enough from sustain, and he is also powerful enough that he is still able to keep up with Sustainless performance with his sustain on certain game modes like Memory of Chaos, but not Pure Fiction though. I do think in the future when he has trouble keeping up, he might need a sustain to keep up. But E2 Blade will be strong enough to not require it for a long time. As a sub DPS or a buffer, he is even stronger in Sustainless, since he can taunt all the damage to him to prevent damaging onto the actual team. He greatly reduces RNG by taunting all the damage to him. Given he is also HP scaling, he can take a lot of hits without going down, and his ability to revive makes it easier to use him in Sustainless. But how about other teams? For relation teams, most of them don't scale off attack, which means you can build fully defensive stats on all of them to tank more damage. The same is for most supports, so they can just be tanky as well. For attack scaling DPS, it can be a bit RNG, but you usually do enough damage or have M-Blade to prevent them from taking damage. You can also abuse their kits to avoid taking damage. For example, Zelie is very good in Pure Fiction Sustainless, since she can keep chaining her extra turns. Anaxa can implant weaknesses to break bars to delay enemies. Ice and imagined characters can proc freeze or imprison to delay another turn. I know stat effects are rarely talked about, but they can still be quite important. For example, in the 4.2 Memory Chaos, you would use RMZ to freeze the fish in Anaxa Sustainless to prevent taking damage. There are no RNG in any of this. For the most part, I believe player skill matters more than RNG and Sustainless, and you generally have to be pretty unlucky to die, or else you have to screw up. Otherwise, it is more likely an investment issue on builds or Eidolons. Obviously, Castorice and Silver Wolf Global Passive can alleviate that. Speaking of Castorice, I want to talk about her specifically. She is the only character that wants a sustain, or more specifically, a healer. But why is that? Unlike most characters who benefit very little or if anything directly from sustain, she benefits massively. Her A2 major traits means that she can charge her ult from healing, which is already very beneficial. Her talent wants the team to have fluctuating HP to increase dragon damage, which is why Hyacinth S1 is so good with her. Furthermore, her own skill also drains her team HP, so the need for a sustain is much greater. This means her own HP drain already strongly demands a healer, but it also helps charge her ult and buffs her damage. On top of the fact that if you're using Hyacinth, she also buffs caster HP, increasing her damage even more. The entire caster's team is also all HP scalers, so Hyacinth's value is exponentially more. There are, however, scenarios where you will have to use a sustain, such as Pollux or the last anomaly where the HP drain was quite brutal. In a normal king, the 500 HP drain was still manageable enough for people to run Sustainless, but in Plight it jumped to 1000, which is too much for most teams, unless you were a Finon player. Even Firefly had to use Lingsha for Plight. Unless you had a 30 plus cost team, you were basically forced to use a sustain. So there are, indeed, rare scenarios where a sustain is better than Sustainless. However, this raises another question. Why are sustains so weak? I'm going to draw some comparison to Hoyo's sister game, Genshin Impact here. In Genshin, Siege Wing is considered one of the worst characters, because all she really does is heal. That's kinda all she does. However, characters like Jalonin, Charus, Lene, Bennett, Nicole, etc. are quite good. This is because their sustain is a secondary capability, and their primary roles are buffing the team.
Even if they don't have healing capabilities, they're still very good characters because what they offer in buffs are usually enough, and the healing is just a bonus.
That's kind of the problem with the current sustains in Honkai Star Rail, in my opinion. Most of them are primarily sustains that have buffing as a secondary capability. In their base kit, both Luocha and Aventuring do not actually buff the team at all. Fushan only offers a bit of crit rate, and Lingsha offers a tiny bit of break damage debuff. Even as mighty as Hyacinth is, her base kit only increases max HP and doesn't actively buff the team if you're not HP scaling. Danhen similarly only offers a bit of attack buffs. The buffs are simply too weak to justify using them, even if the sustain themselves actually do decent damage, like Downhand and Hyacinth. Ironically, this is what makes Ho-Ho special, despite her having quote-unquote poor sustaining capability. Ho-Ho not only offers attack buffs, but can actually regenerate energy for her entire team. She is unique in this ability, but even that isn't enough to justify using her over just another sustainless buffer in peak performance. As we all know, Sunday also has energy regeneration in his kit, but that wasn't enough to justify using him over Sparkle in most teams, as it stands right now. I do hope future sustains in Star Rail will have actual buffing capability closer to sustainless performance. Some speculate Pearl will be an Elation sustain, which we don't really have any information on, but if she is, hopefully she'll bring something unique to the table that actually justifies using her over sustainless option. Because as it stands right now, if you only care about peak performance, it is simply better to go sustainless. So basically, Sustainless is a great way to clear faster and offers a different gameplay experience that can be enjoyable. There are indeed drawbacks to this playstyle, and some bosses or debuffs would force you to run Sustain. However, I do think most of the issue is rooted in the fact that Sustains in Star Rail are simply too weak to hold their own, unlike Sustains in Genshin, for example, that can generally play both roles quite well. Anyways, if you found that video entertaining, be sure to like and subscribe.